quiet.
So unnerving.
I guess you both are a little bit responsible of this kind of silence. Of course, when you are listening, knowing that you afterwards you have to say something, the question what to say is kind of recurrent the whole time. The first thing I thought I want to say, and I really want to say, is that I would have no problem to not say anything. I was very happy listening to you, and I will have no problem, and I guess I'm not the only one in this room, to just stand up, go home, or just go for a long walk. Nevertheless, in trying to not disturb the medium of observation you create in a fantastic way with your presentations, I would like just to try not to be too analytical, to try a kind of topology of the ways aurality create enabling conditions for possible worlds, which I think I would say, and I would suggest, is the common or a possible common theme of both presentations. Presentations that went through a huge range of worlds, from the world of a adolescent coming into school and coming into own life, to the political system in which all adolescents have to find now their way to really become a subject. In this range, it seems to be possible to differentiate between different kinds of functions of the aural towards the generation or the identification of possible worlds. And this goes from the role of aurality as periphery in a visually and linguistic dominated culture. I mean, I'm trying to just identify the potentialities of the aural, according to what I believe to have understood listening to you. One of this potentiality is on this realm of the peripheral, the night, the excluded, the oppressed, the dark, even the invisible, not referring as just something which is not possible to be here, but as a kind of quality of presence. I guess it begins there, or it's possible to set a beginning there, which it does not so much relate to the own potentiality of sound, of listening, but the potentiality that it acquires through the position, the social and political position, which is, which maybe has now. And it goes to different forms of listening together, being together through a collective listening, to forms of sound organization. So I see there a huge spectrum of possibilities or typologies of the aural as enabling condition for possible worlds. I just wanted to, I don't formulate that as a question, but as a kind of offer, in order first to you to say something if you would like, and right away for the public to intervene whenever you want. There is a microphone there, and I just wanted to establish a possible bridge.
Okay, Alex, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, that you chart there that I find very interesting and that I think we're all kind of engaged in reflecting upon is this moment, we could say, between a kind of experience, a kind of experiential relationship to a sound or to an event of hearing, and how that might lead us into, as you say, a kind of question or condition of organization, which also makes me think a little bit about the notion of a logic, like the particulars of an acoustical logic, that I think Salomé is obviously very engaged with also, in terms of trying to demarcate a very specific kind of almost like paradigmatic acoustical structure or kind of acoustical logic, from which then a series of questions and a series of almost like propositions and speculations follow. So this for me, becomes a concern or a kind of focus. And I guess for myself, I've been led to develop that in different ways, and in this, for this evening, to think or to apply that a little bit to experiences of marginality and experiences of a certain tension around questions about freedom and about certain confrontations with certain social and political systems. How a kind of acoustical logic can enable types of resistances or can enable almost a kind of self-consciousness about particular communities who in a way are struggling to also understand themselves, in a sense, so as a community, so to find identity through also what we might understand as acoustical logic. This is something I tried to engage with this evening.
Can I jump
Yeah.
in? Because I think I agree, of course, somewhere I'm quite literally using philosophy of logic, but I think what I'm intrigued by is maybe paradoxically how it offers you to be illogical. And I think that's why I like David K. Lewis, because in some sense, he's a bit of a pariah in possible world theory, because he's actually quite mad. This idea that, there are all these possible worlds. So I like the kind of illogical of that logic as well. And because it gives you the possibility to really rethink, completely rethink. And I think I thought it was very serendipitous. I made quite a lot of notes when Brandon was talking, this kind of the overlaps we have between the dark and the night, and I think that maybe thinking about it just this right now, that what is intriguing about the logical and the possibility gives with the illogical is that it can take away, like the night takes something away, and then you can add something else, because in order to change things, it's so difficult to change stuff because it's so here. What the norm, what we have to expect is so in your face. It's so present everywhere. And so in order to change anything, unless you just want to make little incremental change, as in, as a politician would, and be political in a governmental sense about it, you really have to think it away. I think you almost have to think the world away to really come to possibilities that aren't just deductions of what is here, but that are, maybe truly impossible. So that's why I like the dark and the night and the deprivation in order to come to a different imagination.
Yeah, it's very in the same line. I wanted to comment that. Maybe just two things, and I promise not to say anything and to do what I said I was going to do, to just open the mic for you. But just 2 points. The one, I think I would say you were using logic as a kind of metaphor. So we can talk about architecture, the architecture of something, and we don't meet walls, but it's a kind of organization which is not the organization. I have to think, for example, in last book of Alba Noé, in terms of practices of reorganization. Organization not of organization of sound, but of much more, and first of all, organization and reorganization of behavior. Yeah, so it's another way to behave, another way to interact, another way to engage. So I would think that this is what you mean with the term logic. A kind of a principle of organization, as Cage would say. And the second point, which is also for me paradoxical, but in a beautiful way, is the idea of overcoming marginality through marginal ways of behavior. I mean, forms of resistance sounds like something strong through that which is in the periphery. So behaving as you were picturing when you were with your group of teenager friends in the margins of. And there is also culturally where probably or partly sound and listening and orality and this oral logic is to be found. So the paradox would be like to overcome marginalization through kind of practicing forms of marginalization or marginalized practices. We are looking at you. It's your turn.
Yes, if there's any comments or curiosities.
So thank you very much. It was a very nice lecture, 2 very nice lectures. I think, for my opinion, it's not really new what you describe, but the way you describe it is new. So if we look to the discussion, I come to this from the Stones example. In Germany, if you look to the history of popular music scholarship, there is a work which is called Beat the Speechless Opposition. So, and it remembered, when we heard the Stones now, it remembered me to this work we read in the 80s. So, but it was a sociological work, and it was not described as you describe it in these days. So, now I come to my questions. What are the consequences for scholars speaking about the relationship between the musical or the sounding environment and the reception or the experience? How can we describe the relationship in a better way? Is a consequence that we have only to describe only in remarks, only as experiences or in a poetic way, or is there a way we can build a balance between a traditional scholar way and a narrational way of poetry or preaching?
Yes, no, thank you for your question and for kind of also pointing at this, you might say, kind of methodology or kind of approach that I think also Salome and I also kind of share, or there's sort of commonality there. And then I would also say you find quite strongly, I would pose a little bit, at least on a kind of Anglo-American cultural perspective, within the field of sound studies, I think you find quite a predominant thread related to this approach, which also for me sounds, is kind of interesting, and I sort of wonder about, why that is within at least the more recent emergence of sound studies as a kind of identifiable kind of practice or discipline. You have a certain kind of drift towards, I think, also what Alex described as artistic research, a kind of discourse, a kind of attitude, a sensibility in terms of approaching sound studies and seeing it at least in relationship to practice, I think. And when you see a lot of people working or sort of developing work within that field who are also practitioners, in a sense, who have quite a strong relationship to a kind of sonic practice. And they sort of then, in a way, start to occupy this position that you identify a little bit between a kind of scholarship and narration or a certain poetic sensibility. And the only thing I kind of think to myself, well, going back to what I call the acoustical logic, which of course I would never be so strict about in terms of its relationship to the illogical, There, I think what I also would suggest is within that acoustical logic, you have this kind of relationship to discourse that starts to maybe look or approach a voice, a methodology, an attitude that tries to, I sort of think, maybe occupy a little bit this sort of in-between areas and sort of also embrace the necessity to narrate, in a way, to narrate the experience one has of listening, to narrate the experiences one has of listening together, or to somehow relate to these edges that I think Salomé is talking about the possible impossible. How does one scholarly approach that, in a sense? And so I think the idea of the poetic sensibility or the narration becomes a vehicle, or at least a kind of opening that allows for that kind of discourse to emerge. So I'm quite interested in also reflecting upon that, as you say, like what are the consequences of that, or what does that do, or what does that start to produce in terms of knowledge and in terms of a kind of collective conversation. So it is a kind of phenomenon that I think we should take seriously also.
And I think part of it is the vocabulary and what vocabularies we have to describe anything, and how our idea of reality and of knowledge is tied to the vocabularies we have. And therefore almost this need to maybe have somewhere poetry come into it, quite literally in my case, to kind of to give legitimacy to words that would maybe not normally happen in that particular scholarly discourse, and to bring them in, and therefore to have a different imagination. And I think a consequence that I would, if we have to be concrete about consequence, a consequence I quite like to see is that scholarship's an area where they're maybe thinking of themselves still in quite visual terms, where the word visualizer is used, or the word seeing and is used. I think there, for example, this word experience is quite useful, because I don't think we ever see, actually. We don't see, we experience. Seeing is just one aspect. And as another anecdote, as we're going through anecdotes, I recently been to CERN in Geneva, and they showed me all their visualizers and their sort of funny little machines and gadget that they have to visualize these invisible particles that they use in the Hadron Collider. And he was the physicist who talked to me. He was very convinced that this was really a good translation of what was invisibly there. And when I then sort of suggested, well, what about contact mics or accelerator microphones? Couldn't that be used as well? He just said, oh, but I don't know how to listen. But he completely assumed that he knew how to look. That he knew how to look at these visualizers and understood how to interpret them. He had no doubt in his ability to do that, in that knowledge he had, which is really, to me was fascinating, because he had words for it. He had consensus for the words he was using. He didn't need poetry. It was just this meant this and this meant that. And I think I'd like him to be a little bit more doubtful, or to at least acknowledge that, well, maybe I could listen, and because if you're that certain about what you see, there's many things you won't see. Yes, you might get really good results, but there are other things you won't see. And so I think in this completely different discipline of physics, I think there should be maybe there could be a poetic influx. And all of a sudden, this particular physicist would think, well, given that these particles are invisible, that are going around and around here, maybe I could be a bit more open to a different vocabulary and to a different sense of engagement. And I think sound, because of its sort of almost underdevelopment in many ways. I mean, we're all very visually literate, and we have loads of words for visual things. It just sort of opens up another, like I call it a portal or an access point to rethink things we think we know. And so I hope it has consequences for scholarship all around.
And maybe just a small note about methodology, so not so much about the consequences, because I'm not so much interested in the consequences, but in the approach. I would say not through the consequences that cannot come through an operation of apply the one on the other or the other on the one, but much more on a procedure of osmosis, I would say. I think it's very interesting what is, I think it's very interesting and very positive for the for academia, that these forms of reflection through oral practices, through written practices, are accepted as contributing to, I would not say production of knowledge, but the emergence of knowledge, and then just to let them coexist. You know, I think this coexistence is extremely interesting, and you can already see kind of hybrid forms of writing that are influencing both academic and the, I would say, aesthetic, poetic. I don't know where it leads, but I'm sure it leads to an enrichment of what we call knowledge society. Yeah.
The innumerable sonic possible worlds that there seem to be, how do we tell whether any of them are any good or not?
They're all good.
No, see, that's
And
where I disagree.
is that a good enough stance?
Yes. No, I don't. Unlike Brandon, I think sonic possible worlds can be just as vicious or full of war and bad things as any other worlds. I don't think sound is per se better, or what we could hear always points to something more benevolent. I see more that the listening to it is a strategy to maybe understand a war or understand a bad situation in a different way. So no, I don't attribute any benevolence to them, any of them. I'm sure you can bring value judgment into it as in anything else, or you can make decisions as to actually this possible world I'm inhabiting right now, I don't like it and I'm going to change it. I think for me, this recourse to sonic possible worlds or to possible worlds is there to understand that it's not the same for everybody. The world is not the same place for everybody. And ultimately, it would allow for a more plural participation in admittedly then kind of some consensual worlds where we have made, through negotiation, made a decision, okay, at this moment in time, we live like that. But that we don't assume the actuality from historical actuality, from what has always been the way it's always been, through the hierarchies and through those who are in power, who have the biggest voice. So in a way, maybe when it's all fantastic, we can get rid of the possible world idea again and go back to thinking, yeah, now we live in a world where actually all the margins and all the people who haven't had a voice all find a voice. So we've made one world out of it. But I think at the moment, I certainly think politically, we're nowhere near that. There are many voices that are not being heard, and then there are some voices that are being heard an awful lot too much, or too much is made of them. And so I think it is a necessity for me of a current sense of the world I live in, that I feel it's a strategy to pluralize, to give more people a voice. And yeah, maybe we're going to make things a bit more difficult, but I don't think assuming that the loudest voices are right and we should follow them in order to get things done, say Brexit, is not such a great idea.
Yeah, and I also think we have this question today in class. Of course, and I would say inevitably we will come to values, yeah, because values come from valences, and valences come from plurality. We can go left or right or straight or backwards, but then first of all we have to have these possibilities, yeah. I mean, before there is value, there is valence. And what I think is interesting in that is like to be able to keep the tension of a situation of a temporary suspension of values, in order that also the values and before that the criteria of establishment of the values also arise from this generative process, which is not a process of identification of possible worlds, but of generation of possible world, also over a collective generation of possible world. And out of this process, in classical terms, we will talk about the continuity between aesthetics and ethics. Yeah? We will also be able to see values being redefined. What I would think would be terrible would be to not be able to keep this kind of generative tension, to cut the process and to impose pre-established values and saying what is right and wrong. I think this would be to lose the opportunity or the opportunities this process is generating.
I also wonder a little bit, I mean, I think maybe going back to this question about sound studies as a particular field of discourse, as a particular space of production of a certain knowledge, then in a way I think we could say one of the consequences of that, and I think somehow I feel committed to this, is that in a way what we're talking about and what we're also producing in a sense is a deepening of an understanding and a relationship to the conditions and the act of listening. You know? And in a way, Peter, I mean, I think you point to a very, very important thing, and in a sense you could say that what we're engaging with is going back to this question of the construction of certain conditions in which, from the perspective of listening, we're actually able to really engage in your question. I mean, we could say that, you know, to really pose that question requires, well, a particular context in which we could really listen and discuss and really go through, you know, the different ramifications, you know, of your question, or apply that question to a very particular context or a particular sonic world or a possible world or an existing world. So I sort of feel like, yes, this is maybe something that almost on a meta level that is important in terms of what's happening in sound studies, or what's the consequence of also a certain kind of discourse that is really written, in a sense, or researched from the position of a listener, you could say. I mean, I sort of feel like also what I get from Salomé's work is, you know, someone who's also really listening through knowledge, listening through research, or researching through listening, or in a way, and then you have a certain, I think, emergence of a kind of discourse that then also, I wouldn't say teaches us, but invites us to also deepen our relationship to sound and listening, in a sense, as a reader-listener, or as a viewer-listener, in which these questions maybe can really be given a certain kind of depth and a certain kind of reflection. At least that's my hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of follow up on that thought. Like, one thing I thought that was really great about both of your presentation styles. First of all, for me, there was just a lot of energy in the thought, and sort of the presentation style really added to that. But also, for me, there's an empowerment of interiority, because you mentioned at one point in your presentation how much freedom there is in framing in the interiority at the certain moments. And for me, when you're focusing on the listening experience, there's something very empowering about that, which I also find very interesting. And so it's not the loudest voice. You can also empower your interior side, which I thought was really just kind of like a follow-up on your thought. I thought that was really great about the whole presentation style. Yeah.
There's time for questions, and there's also time for wine. This is just a further step in a long process, and this will be not the last possibility we'll have to share all these thoughts and experiences. I think it's a good time to close this part of the evening. I would like to thank you both very, very much, and I would like to thank you for your presence here.